Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I'm continuing my discussion on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, our 35th president. Uh, so I ruled out the mafia as a whole. That's because a House Select Committee on Assassinations that was investigating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1978, 79. They ruled out the involvement of the mafia as a whole and or the national crime syndicate. Of course, we understand that as the commission, which was created by Lucky Luciano, and of which he was the chairman. So the commission, of course, that includes the New York families and the Chicago outfit and other outfits that they control, in the Midwest and the West. However, the commission did not rule out individual mobsters, individual members of organized crime, and that includes. So we can include Carlos Marcello. Carlos Marcello was the godfather of the New Orleans Mafia, the Louisiana Mafia, and he controlled, crime in Mississippi. His networks, his organized crime network, went as far as Mississippi and Texas. So, however, the Louisiana Mafia was not part of the commission. It was not part of the National Crime Syndicate. So it's interesting that although the New Orleans Mafia is said to be the oldest documented mafia group in America, went back as far as 1860s, and they have direct ties to the Sicilian Mafia. They still run as independent. As of that time, they were running independently, and they were not part of the commission, the National Crime Syndicate that had been formed by Lucky Luciano. So today I'm just going to talk about Carlos Marcello and his involvement in his ostensible involvement, or as being the mastermind of the JFK assassination. Of course, I'm debunking that. I'm going to be debunking that. Uh, Several books have been written about Carlos Marcello's involvement, particularly since John F. Kennedy and his younger brother, who was his Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, they had started going heavily against Carlos Marcello. In fact, they had deported him at one time. Robert Kennedy deported Carlos Marcello to Guatemala. He secretly deported him to Guatemala in 1961 or so. And, uh, you know, but Carlos Marcello, was able to use some fake documents and get himself back into the U.S. But even prior to that, in the 1950s, the government had started going heavily against the mafia. Carlos Marcello had appeared in a committee in 1951, a hearing in 1951 into organized crime, and he had to plead the fifth, invoked the Fifth Amendment 152 times. In Again, in 1959, he appeared before the Senate McClellan committee that was investigating organized crime, and Robert Kennedy was chief counsel to the committee, and JFK was a senator at that time, and they had grilled Carlos Marcello, and in fact, they'd gored his ox at that time, and there was no love lost ostensibly, since that time. Of course, the mafia, there's anecdotal evidence, and there's talk, rumors, hearsay that the mafia as a whole, in fact, not hearsay, because a former mobster, crime boss, like Michael Franzese, he says it that yes, that they didn't like the Kennedys, right? Because they thought they had helped John F. Kennedy win the presidency, and he sort of turned their, double crossed them by the crackdown on the mafia, through Robert Kennedy. They went, there was these draconian measures. There was this very heavy-handed prosecution of the mafia once Robert Kennedy became Attorney General under JFK's administration. And so, was that enough for them to order a hit? No, we hate many people. Many people hate people, but they don't carry out their execution, right? They don't take the steps to execute them. Uh, in any event, I'm going to just mention some of the books that claim that Carlos Marcello was the mastermind and he was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. One of the authors is a conspiracy theorist. His name's Lamar Waldron, and he said something very interesting. His claims are that Carlos, Carlos Marcello was a mastermind, and one of his co-conspirators was Santos Traficante, who was the boss of Florida. That on his deathbed he made a deathbed confession to his attorney, Frank Regano, who wrote a book, Mob Lawyer, also claiming that Carlos Marcello was the mastermind, that he was involved in a conspiracy that assassinated John F. Kennedy. In any event, Traficante was said to have confessed to Regano, and provided details of how Carlos Marcello had JFK assassinated. Uh, these are the claims of a mob lawyer, right? He also claimed the mob lawyer Frank Regano. He also claimed in his book that Jimmy Hoffa had, you know, uh, given him a note to provide to Traficante to have that he and Marcello should have JFK killed. Again, these people he's talking about, right? These are mobsters that were dead, right? He revealed these things when they were dead. And something about many criminal defense lawyers, they're known to be liars, right? They engage in egotistic swashbuckling. They misrepresent. They can be very disingenuous. They do tell lies, right? It's unfortunate, but many criminal defense lawyers are known for that, especially if they're trying to sell a book. So that's one aspect. That was Frank Regano's mob lawyer, right? Those were his claims. In addition, the conspiracy theorist Lamar Waldron, he claims that Carlos Marcello was a mastermind, and after he had JFK killed, he eliminated people that had been conspirators and were knowledgeable of the conspiracy that assassinated JFK, so that they would not turn federal informants. So Waldron claims that Marcello was behind the assassination, the killing of crime boss Sam Giancana. That's a Chicago crime boss who had been the public face of the the Chicago crime family, and also Johnny Roselli. So, and Waldron also claims, that's Lamar Waldron, he also claims that Carlos Marcello, in order to execute the assassination of JFK, he planted false evidence, decoys, red herrings, and he used basically what we call today disinformation. That's what it is, disinformation. He used disinformation to make it seem that it was the FBI and CIA that were involved in the conspiracy to kill JFK, just to embarrass the FBI and mislead the media, the press, right? So amongst the decoys that Lamar Waldron mentions was when Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have gone to the Cuban and Soviet embassy in Mexico City, so that he could procure a visa to travel to the Soviet Union. Of course, he was denied. Now, Lamar Waldron said that was not uh, Lee Harvey Oswald, that it was actually a lookalike of Lee Harvey Oswald, and it was one of the schemes that Carlos Marcello masterminded um, in order to mislead the media and the FBI and the CIA. Now, again, the mafia has its MO, its modus operandi, right? They have their signature killings, their signature activities, right? Their trademark, the way they do things. I've mentioned that the way uh, JFK was killed by Harvey Oswald, the gunshots, those are not the signature kill. They're not the trademark killings of the mafia. So, what Lamar Waldron is claiming is that the mafia deliberately misled, right? Deliberately misled, use these red herrings to confuse the media, the press, and the public. Now, apart from saying, well, the misleading and the deception, the subterfuge, the red herrings, that's not the style of the mafia. Again, that's not their modus operandi, right? Different organizations, they have the way they conduct themselves. Again, the mafia, they have their code of conduct. They take the omerta. And then they have the rules. They don't even kill prosecutors. Like I said, I done a video giving an example of how Lucky Luciano actually had a mobster, a very powerful mobster, Dutch Schultz, killed just because he wanted to kill the prosecutor, Thomas Dewey. You know, that's a no-no. And that Thomas Dewey was the one who ended up locking up imprisoning the most powerful mobster. That's Lucky Luciano himself, who forbade the killing of that same prosecutor. So they have their code of conduct, their modus operandi. Uh, Subterfuge, it's not known to be the way they operate, because when they do a killing or they do something, they leave their mark, because the mafia also uses fear, right? They use fear and intimidation as deterrence, right? So they don't have to use violence. They have this symbolic power, right? So gaslighting, you may call it. Um, However, an outfit that uses subterfuge, disinformation is the KGB, right? And or other intelligence outfits, intelligence agencies. I'd say even the CIA. Those are the people that use. Those are the organizations, the entities that use subterfuge, red herrings, disinformation. That's their style, and that's consistent with what I've been saying. That uh, it is more plausible that it was the KGB or the GRU or the Soviets, and the entities that actually had infiltrated the U.S. or the CIA or any of our government agencies and had JFK assassinated. So, so in any event, Lamar Waldron, makes this claim that I think is a bit outlandish, that Carlos Marcello had a Lee Harvey Oswald lookalike pretend, a Lee Harvey Oswald lookalike pretend that he was, intending to go to the USSR, or you pretend he was intending to obtain a visa from the USSR by making an appearance, um, by making an appearance at the embassies of Cuba and the Soviet Union, just to be a decoy for an event they're going to execute much, much later on, right? Several months later. Very unlikely. What happened in November of 1963 was Carlos Marcello, in fact, was being prosecuted, for fraudulently obtaining fake documents to re-enter the United States, because again he had been deported to Guatemala in 1961 by Robert Kennedy, by the government, and uh, you know you know, later on, and when he re-entered the U.S. in 1963, November 1963, he was being investigated. He was being, they're trying to prosecute him for using fraudulent documents. It was called, conspiracy to defraud the United States government and things like that. So that was what was going on at that time. Um, if Carlos Marcello indeed was the mastermind in the assassination of JFK. Again, remember these mafia bosses who sit at the top of the food chain. They're very, they're very savvy, right? They're very savvy. They're actually very intelligent with regard to their business. What would be in it for him or his organization, right? If his objective was to end the prosecution by the federal government, by the feds, his prosecution by the feds. Well, that did not occur with the assassination of JFK, and it was more likely to even bring down a heavier crackdown if he indeed had been involved in the assassination of JFK. Right? It was more likely uh, to instigate more draconian investigation, and if they found that he was the one who indeed ordered the hit, um, it could end in his death sentence, with a death penalty. He could lose his life. You see, he wasn't even able to shake off after the assassination of JFK. He was not able to shake off, uh, you know, Fed investigations because he was subsequently entrapped in what was called the Bree Lab. Right? It was called the Bry Lab scandal. Bry Lab is just a it's acronym for bribery and labor. So, in the 1980s, the FBI had this sting operation in which they they literally entrapped, right? They used undercover agents to pose as insurance agents to entrap Carlos Marcello and other state government officials in Louisiana in corruption and bribery of state officials. So, uh, Carlos Marcello was not able to shake off or forestall his eventual prosecution and conviction for something as little as trivial as a bribery, bribing of state officials. How would he get off, shake off the government's investigation and prosecution of the biggest murder in the United States? That was not going to happen. At best, what happened was the mafia tried to take claims. That's Carlos Marcello. They tried to take claims for the killing, for the assassination of the president, right? Something that they wished occurred in order to sort of boost their image as a notorious outfit to be feared, right? So sort of some egotistical swashbuckling, as I said, so that they just in the aftermath, what was more likely is after Lee Harvey Oswald was killed, and nobody knows who, and the mafia didn't even know who was involved. They had one of theirs, a mobster, that's Jack Ruby, assassinates Lee Harvey Oswald, thinking, well, it would put them in good graces with the government in case if they believed that, well, it was a government who ordered that hit. They thought they may have had Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald because they thought, well, they acted independently. They may have acted independently. This is just my hypothesis of what is more likely to have occurred. That they had Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald to put them in good graces with the government, with the FBI or the CIA, because that would just quash any further investigations in case the government had any skeleton in their cupboards, any skeleton in their closet regarding the assassination of JFK. That is more likely to have occurred. Why would Jack Ruby have made himself the fall guy? Well, he was terminally ill for one, and the mafia, he was they figured they could get him off. He was killing somebody who just committed the biggest crime in U.S. history, right? Killing public execution of a sitting president. So that's more likely to have occurred. In any event, so the Brelab sting operation, in which the government FBI agents literally entrapped, ensnared Carlos Marcello, and had him prosecuted and convicted and imprisoned for bribing state officials. Uh, it shows that this shows that Carlos Marcello didn't have the power to prevent a trivial government investigation of his criminal activities. There was no way he would believe that he had any power to forestall a major crackdown and prosecution for his involvement in, or any ostensible apparent involvement he may have had in the assassination of the president. And the House committee, House Select Committee on Assassinations, they did say that they didn't find any direct evidence, any credible direct evidence linking Carlos Marcello in complicity to assassinate the president. Another book that was written was by a guy who had actually been the chief counsel to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. His name's G. Robert Blakey. He wrote a book, Fatal Hour, and he also alleges that Carlos Marcello was the mastermind, that he was the one who had JFK killed. He was asserting that the assassination of JFK was a mob hit. G. Robert Blakey is not a disinterested writer. He was actually a special attorney on organized crime and racketeering in the criminal section division of the Department of Justice. There's something about prosecutors when prosecutors are going after their target. So he basically had been prosecuting his job had been to prosecute the mafia at one time. When prosecutors are going after their targets, their job is to villainize their targets, right? They're villainizing the person, and they become they have this tunnel vision, this single-mindedness, and they just throw everything at their target. And in fact, they become very irrational. They use all sorts of disingenuous schemes, and all sorts of unsavory mechanisms, artifice, anything they can use. You've heard of prosecutors' offices planting evidence. They use anything they can use just to bolster their case, or at least to make sure their case doesn't fall apart. But in doing this, their cases fall apart. So what I'm saying is, G. Robert Blakey, who wrote this book, Fatal Hour, and pinpointing Carlos Marcello as the mobster who had JFK killed, he wasn't a disinterested party. He has that mindset, that tunnel vision of a prosecutor who sees his target as a criminal to be done away with. He was always going against organized crime, and of course he would look for any way, any grasp at straws to implicate organized crime, and that is exactly what he was doing with his book, Fatal Hour. My intention was to give a little bit background of Carlos Marcello himself, and just show how he had strategically risen to the top of the pile of the New Orleans crime world, and he was very respected even amongst the national crime syndicate, right? In his height, he is said to have been generating about $2 billion in revenues, right, in from all his criminal organization. It was, according to an author, John H. Davis, who wrote Mafia Kingfish. He is said to have been the biggest revenue generator in Louisiana, right, at the height of his operation. So it was generated in the 1960s. He was supposed to have been generating $2 billion in revenues a year. That's Carlos Marcello. By the way, John H. Davis is another writer who claims that Carlos Marcello was the one who masterminded the assassination of, John F. Kennedy. By the way, John H. Davis is also a first cousin of Jackie Kennedy, and he's a smart guy. He was a smart guy. He went to Princeton and Columbia University. But mind you, all these books that have been written by, I call them conspiracy theorists, alleging that, the mob killed JFK. None of them has been written by a researcher, right? A professional researcher or scholar or academic, right? A renowned, a prominent academic. None of them has been written by a renowned academic who does their investigation thoroughly, apply analysis. They just don't use anecdotal evidence and hearsay and rumors and gossip, old wives' tales. They do very credible research. No researcher has done work alleging that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by the mob. Most people of the agreement that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman, and I've talked about how James Woolsey, a former CIA director under President Bill Clinton, he wrote a book, and he claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald was actually he was an agent of the Soviets, and it was the Soviets who had JFK killed, which is more likely. And the red herring that the conspiracy theorists alleging that Carlos Marcello used, those red herrings, the disinformation, that's more in line with the tools, the apparatus, the manner of operation of the KGB and the intelligence agencies of the Soviets. So I'm going to discuss the rise of Carlos Marcello again. That's not because I glorify the mob or have any dealings. I don't have any dealings, but I'm trying to debunk the notion that Carlos Marcello was the one who assassinated JFK. His rise shows calculation, shows an intelligent mind, because he literally had state officials, law enforcement in his pockets, right? This was how successful his operations were. His gambling operations brought in about $500 million. Even, casinos in Las Vegas, paid him, gave him a cut. He got, he he had spread his tentacles so far, and he'd been so entrenched. He would be shrewd enough to understand that his assassination of JFK would be his albatross, would be his Waterloo. It would destroy him. It would probably have him executed. He wasn't executed. He spent most of his final years in prison. A significant part of his final years in prison. He did develop Alzheimer's. He fell to, it was a victim of senile dementia and Alzheimer's while he was in prison. And he was imprisoned for the corruption scandal of the bribery of state officials in an FBI sting. He was literally entrapped. Now, why wasn't entrapment used as a defense to throw the conviction out? Because entrapment is used when the target, the defendant, does not have a propensity for crime. Mobsters cannot use entrapment, right? Because, they do have a propensity for crime. And so that's what they do, right? That's That's their enterprise, so they can't use that as they can't use that as a defense. In any event, his conviction was overturned on a technicality, but it wasn't for what I've just mentioned. So his conviction was overturned. So he did just 8 years out of the 17-year conviction that he uh, got from the Bree Lab and other bribery and conspiracy uh, charges that he uh, was convicted for. In any event, I'm going to do another video just talking about his rise and then finalizing why um, I don't think he, in fact, ordered the hits against JFK. My name is Olurotimi Osha. This video has gotten long, so I want to I'm going to cut it off at this point. I like talking about American presidents, and of course, I've been talking about the assassination of JFK, our 35th president. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. I'm talking about corrupt state officials and government officials, and that's what I'm experiencing in the state of Maryland. Corrupt state officials framed me. They instigated a swatting. Corrupt state officials in the state of Maryland, in Montgomery County specifically, instigated a swatting on me. I was a federal government employee and auditor in the Department of Navy as of May 16, 2023, and I reported misconduct of my bosses, including a Nathan R. Brown, Kirsten Risbeck, Jamie Simon. I reported corruption, public corruption, misconduct, and this was under investigation. And so I was retaliated against, and they used Montgomery County law enforcement, including a Sergeant Charles Drengwitz, a Demarcus Coleman, and they used Jide Warere, a senile man who has dementia, talking about dementia, who misrepresented himself, was impersonating himself as my uncle, right? He's not my uncle. And at best, I'm not going to get into that, but he filed a perjured emergency evaluation petition that ostensibly brought 40 cops, a drone, a helicopter, and law enforcement that misinformed spread disinformation to my neighbors, claiming I was a criminal holding a woman hostage in my apartment. That never happened. Eventually, they shot me in the head. I received stitches on my skull. They shot me in the head with a taser dart, a projectile, and I was tased by 5 law enforcement officers. They attempted to kill me. They threw a smoke bomb, it was, I later learned, was pepper spray and tear gas into my apartment. They had no arrest warrant. They removed me naked, cuffed me to a gurney, removed me naked. And of course, they'd done all sorts of stuff and they almost killed me. And then they framed me with false charges, saying the police officers who assaulted me in my home, who didn't have an arrest warrant, that I assaulted them. The body cam evidence shows they lied, but I'm still being held and detained by Montgomery County State Attorney's Office in order to forestall a prosecution of the rogue cops and the swatting they instigated. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. I'm seeking justice. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.